Hello everyone. Today I want to talk about Ptah-Hotep, the vizier of the pharaoh Djedkare-Isesi. I've mentioned Ptah-Hotep a couple times in my videos. I know that I must have mentioned him in my philosophy video, for example. But I really wanted to talk about Ptah-Hotep himself and kind of go into him a bit more deeply because he is an absolutely fascinating historical subject, and there's a bit of controversy about him as well that I kind of want to talk about. But first of all, who is Ptah-Hotep? So Ptah-Hotep, as I just said, was the vizier of the pharaoh Djedkare-Isesi, and Djedkare-Isesi was one of the pharaohs of the 5th dynasty. And the 5th dynasty was around 2400 BC, so this would have been after the construction of the Great Pyramids at Giza, kind of nearing the end of the Old Kingdom. The historical figure of Ptah-Hotep is supposedly the author of the maxims of Ptah-Hotep, which I have here, translated by Christian Jacques, which is my favorite translation of Ptah-Hotep's maxims. There is a small controversy that arises, though, because there are supposedly two Ptah-Hoteps. There is Ptah-Hotep I, then his son Akhet-Hotep, and then Akhet-Hotep's son Ptah-Hotep. And so we're unsure which one the maxims of Ptah-Hotep are ascribed to. The maxims themselves are teachings about how to live a good life, how to be a good husband, to be a good father, to be a good mentor. Generally speaking, it's just advice for life and how to live in accordance with Ma'at, the goddess of truth, justice, and social and cosmic harmony. We'll get a little more into the topics of the maxims a little bit later. But although Ptah-Hotep is a genuine historical figure, we literally can see in his tomb that he existed, and I had the immense pleasure of going to see the living statues of Ptah-Hotep that were found in his tomb. Unfortunately, the tomb itself is closed to visitors, which I was very sad to hear about, but there is this wonderful book written by Ana Latifa Murad that basically goes through the entire tomb and details all of the text written in it, all of the titles, everything basically that you would need to know about the spatial configuration and the text within it. And so if you can afford to get that, I would absolutely recommend it. It's a very, very interesting read, especially if you're interested in Ptah-Hotep, of course. Ptah-Hotep's name is in reference to the god Ptah, who is the patron god of the city of Memphis, or Men-Nefer, or Min-Nafe, however you'd like to pronounce it, which is kind of situated near Cairo, just south of there in Mitrahina. This is, of course, the general area of where he was buried. Ptah-Hotep was buried in Saqqara, and the statues of Ptah-Hotep are also in the Saqqara Museum, which I would also recommend visiting if you're going to Saqqara. It's a pretty small museum, but it is 100% worth visiting. A lot of people miss it, and it's very sad because it is a fantastic museum, even despite its size. The main controversy, you could say, about Ptah-Hotep is whether or not he actually wrote these maxims. The issue is that we don't have an original text. All of the texts of Ptah-Hotep were transcribed by other scribes who were repeating the maxims of Ptah-Hotep as a sort of literary practice to learn hieroglyphics and the Egyptian language in general as a writing system. So at the end of all the texts, you'll have a line that says, "This goes from beginning to the end in accordance with what was found written down," which basically insinuates again, of course, that what is being written is not actually being written by Ptah-Hotep himself, but by, again, a scribe who is repeating what Ptah-Hotep is saying. Now, of course, this could just be a thing that, it was, of course, written by Ptah-Hotep, but we don't have any evidence of the original piece of writing, or maybe it was an oral tradition that was eventually written down by someone else other than Ptah-Hotep. However, the issue with this lies in linguistics. All of the maxims of Ptah-Hotep are written in Middle Egyptian, which was not in use during the Old Kingdom, at least not until the very end of the Old Kingdom. And while I did say that Ptah-Hotep is near the end of the Old Kingdom, it's not the end. He's still in the 5th dynasty, which firmly places him in the Old Egyptian writing system. And again, you could say that, for example, well, these scribes are just writing it down in their version of the language, which is Middle Egyptian in the Middle Kingdom. However, this doesn't quite work out. Ancient Egyptians were pretty accurate and scrupulous about what they wrote down and the manner in which they wrote it down, although there are obviously some exemptions. But for example, the pyramid texts were first written down in around 2500 BCE, which is, again, the end of the Old Kingdom. But the manner in which these texts are written uses very old Egyptian grammar and styles, which means that it was very, very likely written, or at least composed, much before we first see the instance of it in Unas's pyramid. Likewise, with Ptah-Hotep's maxims, we would expect to see Old Egyptian grammar and styles, but we don't. We only see Middle Egyptian. In every single instance that we see Ptah-Hotep's maxims, it's only in Middle Egyptian, which is pretty damning to the idea that it was written in the Old Kingdom. This kind of takes some of the archaic mystification out of Ptah-Hotep's maxims, which is very unfortunate. I know that some people kind of think that it's less important because it was written in the Middle Kingdom, but I don't think this is true. And whether or not it was written by Ptah-Hotep, these maxims genuinely are fascinating and a very intriguing look into Egyptian philosophy. And I know this ties into my philosophy video, but I don't think I really read many of his maxims, so I want to read my favorite Ptah-Hotep maxims for you, because I think that it might hopefully inspire some of you to read the entirety of Ptah-Hotep. I would not read the entirety of Ptah-Hotep right now because there are over 40 maxims, and I don't think that that would be very entertaining to listen to. So I'm going to read some of my favorites for you, translated by Christian Jacques into French, which is then translated by Marcia de Brito into English. So thank you, Marcia. The length of each maxim can vary. Some of them are quite long, some are quite short. This one is a little bit longer. This is Maxim 14, which Christian Jacques titles On the Proper Attitude Towards Fortune and the Workings of the Heart. In a varied group of people, be sure to make trustworthy allies to show that you yourself are someone worthy of trust. A person who conquers other people's hearts cannot be a hypocrite. The one who is not a slave to material goods can acquire possessions, provided he keeps in mind that he wants them only for a specific purpose. He can then responsibly become capable of leadership, a rich man acting to bring his plans to fruition. Without boasting, he will get a good name. He will be nourished, and he can take good care of those closest to him, and people will speak well of him without his knowing it. But he who obeys the impulses of his greed loses his own conscience and provokes disdain rather than love. He will have to endure the bleakness of a dry heart and a shriveled body, and his body shall not be anointed with oil, for a dry heart goes with an exhausted face. Both are the result of deeds done against the conscience. A big heart, in man or woman, is a gift from God, but he who gives in to the flames of base passion is punished by God, and he will be overcome by his own inner enemy. So in this maxim, Maxim 14, Ptah-Hotep preaches gratitude, as well as being very conscious of why you want things and the purpose of your desires. Ptah-Hotep definitely walks a middle road on whether or not you should be indulgent or austere. And so he doesn't say that you should never lean into your desires, but that you should have these desires for a specific reason, and that maybe you should use them to help other people, which I think is very nice. Maxim 19 is another favorite maxim of mine. Christian Jacques titles it On Greed, an Incurable Sickness. If you want to behave well, free yourself from the grip of all evil and fight any sign of greed. Greed is an incurable, fatal sickness with no remedy. It infects fathers, mothers, and mothers' brothers. It separates wife from husband. Greed is the coming together of all kinds of evil and contains everything that is hateful. A man can only be balanced if he follows the rule of Ma'at properly and treads his path correctly. He must reckon up his wealth with no sense of greed, while the greedy man will have no resting place to give him access to the other realm. This is in reference, of course, to the tombs that the Egyptians made, which were basically meant to give a person access to the other realm, the realm of the gods. Ptah-Hotep again talks about basically greed and that you shouldn't be wanting things just for the sake of wanting them. And I think that this very much applies to the world that we live in today. And that's kind of the funny thing, is that people tend to think that the world has changed so irrevocably that there's just nothing that we have in common with ancient people. But that's obviously not true, which we can see from a variety of texts from ancient Egypt, but not just from ancient Egypt, from many places around the world. I think that there are a lot of themes that have continued to this day. And one of them is the fact that greed is an incurable sickness, and it should be dealt with, and it is one of the worst things to infect humanity. Finally, I want to read Maxim 22, which might be my favorite one, I don't know. This one is titled On Generosity to Those Close to You, which again ties into the greed on the opposite side of the spectrum. Fulfill the needs of those close to you, making use of the blessings your fate has granted you. This is the destiny of those favored by God. He who constantly fails to provide for those close to him is selfish and too pleased with himself. For him, the future remains a closed book, even if he imagines he can foresee what tomorrow will bring. The caw of a just man is a genuine creative energy and makes people rejoice. As soon as occasions arise for congratulation and appreciation, your friends and family will welcome them enthusiastically. We should not look to strangers for consolation. When misfortune strikes, it is to those close to us that we turn. This is again a maxim that I feel is very, very poignant for the modern day, because oftentimes these days when people are feeling depressed or very upset or angry, they turn to the internet and to strangers who read their posts online instead of talking to their family and friends and loved ones. But Ptah-Hotep stresses the importance of creating these good relationships and that it should be reciprocal, that if you are kind to someone, they will be kind in return. And if someone is kind to you, you should be kind to them in return. Of course, this doesn't always work out because the world is not perfect, and oftentimes we can be kind to people and they will return it with anger or hatred. But this doesn't really displace the need for kindness when kindness is appropriate. And that is what Ma'at is all about, which is balance and treating each situation with its own proper attitude, not approaching every situation with the same philosophy and mindset of like, oh, I'm going to be nice to everyone. And so Ma'at basically just stresses that each situation is its own situation and requires its own method of thought. We shouldn't treat things universally. Instead, we need to look at things individually, but with kindness in mind. In ancient Egyptian, these maxims were called sebayts. I haven't reconstructed this word, and I'm not sure anyone has. I don't know how it would have been pronounced in ancient Egypt, but this is what it would have looked like in the hieroglyphics and transliterated into the Latin alphabet. Sebayt is such an interesting word, or just seba in general is a very interesting word because it connects to a lot of different concepts. Mainly what I see it used as is in reference to the stars, die Sterne. So seba would mean star, but it also means doorway. And there's, of course, it's kind of interesting because linguists can often use these kinds of related terms to be like, okay, they thought of these things as being related. But also with ancient Egyptian, the language doesn't always allow for that kind of connection to be bona fide, because sometimes it's a purely phonetical similarity and they use like a determinative of a star just to confirm that the phonetics are the same. I remember I saw once on Instagram this guy reading off of the hieroglyphs of the Temple of Luxor saying that like, oh, this is the doorway of stars, but it's not. It's just a gateway, and they used a star determinative to show that it is the same because Seba also means door or gate. And in this same way, I'm not quite sure of the connection between sebayt and star. But if they are connected, it's very, very interesting to think of a sort of philosophy that teachings are a gateway to another realm of divinity and knowledge. Ptah-Hotep is definitely one of those historical figures that I think is very much worth studying, especially because there is this confusion on whether or not he was the actual author of these maxims or sebayts, these teachings. But whether or not these sebayts are truly as ancient as Ptah-Hotep himself, they are really, really fascinatingly apt for the modern day. And that's why when people come asking about philosophy or about Ma'at, I always point them towards Ptah-Hotep, because Ptah-Hotep is an excellent example of what the ancient Egyptians thought of Ma'at, regardless of whether Ptah-Hotep himself wrote these maxims. They were obviously written by ancient Egyptians and considered to be good advice. And while a good amount of these maxims relate more to how to conduct yourself in governmental affairs, they still very much apply to modern life. For a little while, I was actually really, really fascinated by Ptah-Hotep's maxims, and I decided to write basically an analysis, one analysis for each maxim. I never finished this project, but I think that it is really important to try and glean as much information as we can from this. And I actually put this all on a website if you would like to go check it out, and I kind of dive into more about like what the Ka is, what it represented for Ptah-Hotep, because This annoys me so much. People like to describe the ka, the ba, and the ak in certain ways, but the thing is, like most Egyptian concepts, the idea of what the ba and the ka were, how important they were, and what they represented kind of changed over Egyptian history. And so what the ka meant for Ptah-Hotep was very different from what the ka meant for example, Ramses III. If you're going to read anything from the analysis I put on this Ptah-Hotep website, I would definitely read the central themes of Ptah-Hotep sebayt, because it just goes over the general themes of all of the maxims. So instead of just going through and reading so much of what I wrote based on each maxim, you can just read a general overview of all of Ptah-Hotep's teachings and what I feel they teach us, as well as what Christian Jacques feels they teach us. In his teachings, Ptah-Hotep also implores you to follow your heart, which is something that is very touching, I think. But a lot of people also kind of misread that, and they're like, oh, I'm just going to follow my desires and what my heart says. But you have to remember, in the cultural context, the heart was not just a seat of emotion, it's the seat of intellectual thought, knowledge, and logic. And so to follow your heart means to follow your logic in tandem with your emotions. He says in Maxim 11, follow your heart, your conscience, and your ka, your creative power, all of your life. So, you cannot give in to lower base desires, not to excess, to greed, or to anger, but instead you should build your strength based on intelligence and your ability to control yourself. And at its basis, by applying ma'at to your life, you become fundamentally useful to not only yourself, but to those around you, eliminating isfet, and instilling a sense of ma'at into all things around you. Ptah-Hotep is not a man who believes in humanity's true inner goodness, nor a cynic who condemns all of humanity. He is, from what I've read, not very happy with the state of human affairs. He considers humans as prone to self-destruction and the destruction of those around them. Overall, Ptah-Hotep also advises to listen. In his very first maxim, which is probably his most famous, he states that knowledge can be found anywhere, among maidservants working at the millstone, as well as in great sages, but that you should listen to everyone, because you never know where you're going to find it. And this, I think it's very famous for a very good reason, because people tend to think of ancient civilizations as extremely hierarchical, and I'm not going to argue that Egypt wasn't hierarchical. It absolutely, definitively was extremely hierarchical. But this one little seed of wisdom from Ptah-Hotep, or from the unknown author, shows that there are people who realize that wisdom can be found in every facet of life from every single person, and you never know who it's going to come from. So while listening to sages and wise people is always advised, you shouldn't dismiss other people because you think they might not have any knowledge or you think they might be stupid. Everyone has their own experiences in life, and it allows them to have a very unique way of thinking about things. And by opening yourself up to these new ways of thinking, you allow your mind to expand and understand more knowledge. And so Ptah-Hotep advises you to listen to everyone. Maybe not take all of their advice, but at least to listen. And I think that's incredible. So thank you so much for listening to my little ramble about Ptah-Hotep. Again, I think he's absolutely fascinating, and I really, really advise that you go read, especially Christian Jacques' translation. This book is fantastic. His pre-ramble about Ptah-Hotep's sebayt is amazing. He does an absolutely excellent analysis of all of the content of Ptah-Hotep's sebayt. I know this book isn't available in some places, and I know it also costs money. So I actually took all of the translations that Christian Jacques and Marcia did in this book, and I put them onto my website. Not all of them have an analysis with it, but all of the translations are in there, and so you can go read them in English. Christian Jacques' analysis at the beginning of the book is not included in my website because I didn't feel like that was appropriate. That's Christian Jacques' words, these are Ptah-Hotep's words, but the website has my analysis, if that means anything. So I will put the link to my website in the description so you can go read all of Ptah-Hotep's sebayt. And I really hope that you do, because I think everyone in this modern world can benefit from a little bit of ancient wisdom. So again, thank you for watching. I hope to see you in the next video, and may you always walk with ma'at in your heart. Bye!